I'd like to thank the organizers for putting this discussion and panel together, of course. I'm operating also at one last disadvantage. My colleagues think I was going to be talking about nuclear restarts in Japan because they read that paper that I just published. I'm not even going to be talking about that. Instead, I'm going to be talking about something that has fascinated me now for close to 10 years. And that is the comparative political economy of Japan's decision-making process with respect to the energy sector. Now, we all know that energy, or at least electricity, is a necessity good. We just simply can't live without it anymore. The electrification of Japan is 100%. Electricity prices, and multiple studies have confirmed this, is that electricity is essentially price inelastic. That is to say, no matter what the price of electricity is, consumers still buy it. This is what we call price inelasticity. Now, that means there's also no real substitution effect for electricity. It is a homogeneous good, meaning that you don't really have any branding per se. It's clean, it's relatively low carbon. Unfortunately, it is non-storable. That is to say, with the exception of pumped storage for hydroelectric, you have to generate it to meet supply and demand instantaneously for it to be so-called quickly dispatchable. And finally, it is operating in Japan for the most part on what are known as alternating current, or AC, grid system, as opposed to renewables, which is a DC system. All of that said, what we're looking at as in terms of a little background before we start with my puzzle is to say from the very beginning, Japan is not Germany. It simply is not. On the left, for those of you who have been to Japan, obviously it is an island unto itself. It is cut off from the cheaper electric power in South Korea, Russia, and even Taiwan. But also within Japan, it is operated within 10 fiefdoms, so to speak, which have several bottlenecks and very little ability to transfer electricity from, say, Hokkaido to Kyushu, which is the case that was done in the UK pooling system, for example, for many years. This is not possible in Japan under the current grid system. This is very different from Germany, where, as you can see from the chart, it is trading in both deficits and surpluses of electric power to and from other countries around Europe. That is a form of backdrop to say that Japan is operating within constraints. It is also, as you can see from the left-hand chart, a highly densely populated country. Has approximately 335 people per square kilometer, and it's operating on something of a technological disadvantage. That is to say, what power sources can we place into the Japanese countryside, the Japanese urban areas, in order to fuel an economy which is essentially 15% of the world's GDP, but also it is approximately $16 million per square kilometer versus other countries. It is something of a technical challenge. Consequently, the last backdrop piece of information, as perhaps all of you know, up until fairly recently, Japan had among the highest electricity prices in the world, both for the residential sector as well as the industrial sector compared to Germany or, for example, New Zealand. Keep in mind, ladies and gentlemen, this is no longer the case. Now, Germany and Denmark and various European countries have the highest electricity prices in the world. Japan no longer has that dubious honor. Keeping all of this in mind, my puzzle, if we could talk about a puzzle, is first and foremost, deregulation has come to Japan finally after it had spread from Chile in the late 1980s to Margaret Thatcher's England, to Norway, to Australia, to New Zealand, to Germany finally in 1998, to various states within North America, starting with California in 1995 and 4 provinces in Canada. Japan started in 1995. In fact, if you look at this chart, from 1964 all the way up until 1995, there was virtually no regulatory change within the electricity market, aside from nuclear, aside from energy specific. The electricity market itself had virtually no regulatory changes, political ordinances, laws, regulations, etc. Everything happened between 1995 and 2007, actually. The question is, how is it that we went from a country in 1995 where everyone, including the Japan Communist Party, wanted electricity reform, to virtually no one by 2007? That is to say, if you take a look at votes within committee for both L, which is the lower house, and U, the upper house, for and against, you notice something quite spectacular, or at least highly interesting. Everyone in the standing committees within the Japanese Diet voted for. They wanted it. Starting in, that was phase 1 of electricity deregulation. Phase 2 of electricity deregulation began its debate in 1999. The Japan Communist Party was the first to stand up and say, this is a bad idea. This is going to make electricity prices go up even higher. We do not believe they will go down. We believe that wages will suffer. We actually believe that international, domestic energy security will suffer. We vote against. 2003, the Japan Socialist Party joins the Japan Communist Party in opposing further electricity reform. Interestingly enough, they also cite the unproven economic results not only abroad, but also the various questions as to why we're having electricity restructuring. What is the point? You'll notice, actually, that the number of committee meetings, the number of Shinkikai meetings, that is to say Ministerial Advisory Council meetings, the number of newspaper articles, grow exponentially. Questions, uncertainty abounds. So much so that by 2007, when it came finally to liberalize the residential sector, the 40% remaining of the electricity market, they decided against. The Japanese language transcripts for both the Shinkikai, which I've sat in on personally, as well as the standing committees within the Diet, is fascinating. What they talked about was fascinating. And I'd like to put this puzzle to you. Why did such a diffuse public interest, like electricity deregulation, initially prevail by getting on the national agenda in the early 1990s, only then to face such an unusual degree of skepticism and resistance 15 years later? That is the question. Now, if you follow the academic literature on this matter, I think you can say that it broadly comes down to 2 explanatory hypotheses. One is what I call the interest-based model, which says that everything comes down to profit maximization, individuals, a zero-sum game. Every actor has clear fixed preferences. They have long-term strategies, and at least the incumbent suppliers, they exhibit what we call in economics rent-seeking behavior. That is to say, they use political resource endowments, advertising budgets, cash contributions to political parties, and various other voting techniques to pressure the regulator in order to adopting their position. Some people like to call this the regulatory capture model. As opposed to this, you have the ideas-based model. This simply says that what cannot be explained by interest must be explained by something else. What will it be? And it argues that conceptual economic ideas, that long periods of stasis, even though your economic interests have been damaged, are essentially imported from abroad, and they are actually controlling an image that builds a consensus, even though it does not work in the best material interest of all the actors concerned. And the model, which we'll skip over, which I'm using from Frank Baumgartner and Brian Jones' award-winning book, The Politics of Attention, essentially says that all of us have essentially value-laden belief systems, paradigms in which we interpret the world, and we look at little bits of information in order to interpret our paradigms and models in our head, even economic models, neoclassical models, in order to see if the data still holds. And if you use this model to interpret electricity restructuring, how it got onto the agenda, and how decisions were made, I think it explains a great deal about what I'd like to talk about, which is 4 equilibria within Japan. The commercial electricity market began in 1883. Now, in my doctoral dissertation, I have to apologize. I have actually 6 charts, not 3, for each equilibrium, and it discusses in detail not only the market, but how these markets came about. But to go very quickly, the first equilibrium was based entirely from 1883 to 1930 on laissez-faire capitalism. It was cutthroat competition. If you were to look at the top chart, you can see quite clearly the number of entrants that came into the Japanese market. The number of entrants skyrocketed from 0 to as high as almost 712 competing Japanese electric power companies. The situation got so ridiculous that not only were they generating, transmitting, and distributing electric power, but they had competing lines coming to the same house from 2 different companies, going through someone's window. So you had 3, 4, sometimes 5 different distribution cables coming into the same house. This was actually causing huge bankruptcy problems, but it was tolerated for years, not only in Japan, but worldwide, including in Germany, until regulations started to get into effect starting around 1911. What you'll notice, and I don't have the chart here, is that from abroad, economists began to question the whole point of laissez-faire as it applies to what is now known as a public good for electricity. So, a top-down decision was made by the Japanese government to erect a second equilibrium starting in 1931, which was the creation of Nippatsu, the Japanese state-owned mega corporation. It was one nationwide mega utility. Companies bottom-up did not demand this. It was actually erected in order to rectify what they believed, not only in Japan, but worldwide, was a growing contradiction. How is it that we can maintain efficiencies for fixed assets, such as transmission and distribution cables, while also transmitting electricity? Can there be an efficient model? And the idea was to bring them all together under one corporate umbrella. This answered the question of bankruptcies, but interesting enough, from reading the literature, what I was surprised to find is there's very little evidence to suggest that there was bottom-up pressure to the Japanese government to correct this. In fact, there's quite a lot of evidence to suggest a top-down approach based on economic studies from abroad that the Japanese government responded to. By 1951, after Japan lost the war and the occupation took place, The new dealers from the United States under GHQ and Douglas MacArthur implemented the third equilibrium, which as economists would refer to as the natural monopoly approach. Once again, this is the idea held that you should have electricity, generation, transmission, distribution, and sales, all controlled by one company. And there were 9 vertically integrated companies, all privately owned, under American direction, in Japan, that lasted with virtually no regulatory interruptions from 1951 until 1994. Now, the question is, if we were to take a look and focus now on the fourth equilibrium, that is to say, 1995 to present, what is driving this, what I would call cynicism or skepticism about electricity reform in Japan pre-Fukushima? Well, I think a large part of it comes down to image or perception. Now, what you're looking at is data culled from the Asahi Shimbun, one of Japan's largest newspapers. These are Japanese language articles, and they are indexed to 100 at 1995 versus real electricity prices in Japan. Not surprisingly, after the oil shock in 1973, real electricity prices rose. I won't get into the analysis of why electricity prices were high. If you'd like to talk about that, I have some very interesting slides that actually analyzes why Japanese electricity prices are not only high after the oil shock, but stayed high. And it has nothing to do with fuel costs. But leaving that aside, what you notice in real terms is that the electricity prices haven't really changed very much. But what has changed is attention. Look what's happened. The black line are articles that in the Asahi Shimbun discuss Japan's high electricity prices. The dotted line, this line here, are articles that discuss deregulation in general. And finally, the gray line, which is this line here, are articles in the Asahi Shimbun discussing electricity deregulation. And what you notice, before 1995, there was a noticeable and sizable increase in attention from 1982 until 1995. Now, rather than it being a bottom-up, concerted interest attack by utility companies to deregulate the market, what is interesting to find in this particular case is that when you look at the Shingikai, the Ministerial Advisory Council transcripts, and you look at the Standing Committee within the Diet transcripts, the power companies never wanted electricity reform. They simply did not want it. It was imposed on them because the consensus at the time was, if you look abroad and if you look at scientific consensus from economists, they all unanimously agree, well, with a few exceptions. Electricity deregulation is good for Japan. It's good for the consumer. It brings consumer welfare gains. It brings increased shareholder value to stockholders. And of course, it brings greater corporate efficiencies. That was the mantras to justify liberalization, not only in Japan, but abroad. Nothing about renewable energy was ever discussed in 1995 or 1999. You won't find it in any of the transcripts. Nothing. It was all about the consumer, including the industrial consumer, and it was about bringing down ridiculously high electricity prices. And yet, as you see, it never happened. Electricity prices never really came down. Instead, this is what's happened. Since the early 1980s, the Japanese power companies have seen decreasing return on their invested capital that is a long-term linear trend. It continues to fall. Value destruction continues to happen. When I showed this graph to management of all the power companies well before Fukushima, and I asked them, why do you want a centralized power system that forces upon you the mandates of universal service, which is they have to supply electricity to any consumer that wants it, number one. Number two, they cannot afford, under a deregulated system, or even before that, to have blackouts because of the fear that their credibility would be lost, so they would go to a new entrant. And number three, continually worry about building nuclear and power plants and other forms when it clearly is hurting the company. And their answer was shocking to me. They said, up until the 1990s, we were told by economists over and over again that this problem would eventually correct itself, that there would be increasing returns to scale and efficiencies sooner or later in the long term, that this was a blip, that this should not be happening. But it is. And it's happening precisely because expenditures are rising more quickly than revenues. And revenues are basically flat because of the regulated tariff system and the political pressure to keep Japan's already high electricity prices fairly stable. The result is declining operating profits with increasing capital expenditures to build ever more facilities in order to maintain a system that cannot afford to have blackouts. The question now is, taking into consideration all these constraints, the pressure for energy security, economic efficiency, consumer welfare, investor value creation, and of course, environmental friendliness, which is the latest constraint now imposed on the market, what will happen by 2020? Will investors, bank lenders, corporate bond owners, bank loans, continually to privately fund a system that is seeing ever lower returns on their investment? When, in fact, today, and I did show it, the weighted average cost of capital, which is imposed or required by investors, is now so much higher than the return on actual invested capital, making all of this not value creation, but value destruction. This is the problem. And the final question is, why would anyone want to keep a centralized system that is virtually and slowly imploding over time? Well, I really am puzzled by that, just as I'm puzzled at the rising asset prices in Japan, not only for nuclear power plants, which is on the left, but also the decreasing returns and profitability on the right, which applies not only to nuclear, it applies to all facilities in Japan: hydroelectric dams, coal-fired plants, oil-fired plants, and perhaps, and you might disagree about this, eventually, renewable energies. Not because the technology per se is going to suddenly find higher prices, but because within Japan's geographic, economic, and population constraints, you have a clear, what I would call, cost of NIMBY problem, which is forcing in the siting, the licensing, and construction of essential facilities, increased regulations, which are forcing the companies to, in order to protect themselves and avoid customers from leaving them, do what must be done to pay off locals who simply do not want these facilities in their backyard. And it is not just nuclear power. If you have read Daniel Aldrich's excellent book, Site Fights, you'll learn that it's applies to airports, it applies to hydroelectric dams, it applies to anything that's in your backyard that you just don't want. And this is the contradiction, finally. We want it all. We want stable supplies of electricity. We want it 24 hours a day. We want it cheap. Oh, and the latest constraint is we want it to be environmentally friendly. Good luck. Good luck with that, okay? Because as you see here, it comes with a trade-off. And I'm fascinated by everyone who doesn't want to talk about this. They want to talk about pie-in-the-sky technological achievements without dealing with on-the-ground realities in Japan. And finally, to get back to the issue of perception. If you're wondering why, in all of the discussions within Japan of why it soured by 2007, starting with the communists and spreading to the LDP, including in the Shingikai, where various interest groups and even academics, which formed about 50% of the Shingikai, over and over and over again, and I'm sorry, the numbering is off, brought this up. California crisis, Enron bankruptcy, persistently high electricity prices in foreign markets, declining shareholder value in listed power companies abroad, stranded costs, for example, the almost bankruptcy of British Energy in 2000, and of course the Northeast blackout of 2003. All of these were discussed by the Japanese, making uncertainty very high. Just as there is a great deal of uncertainty today, post-Fukushima, about nuclear power. So, in conclusion, I think these four discussed equilibria reflect long periods of broad legislative and regulatory inaction. There is little evidence of, and because my slides were corrupted, I couldn't even put them here. Little evidence of increased political resource endowments correlating with sudden regulatory and legislative changes. In fact, for those of you who are interested in my study in this, I recently published one called Who Controls Whom, which was in an edited volume that actually tests for political resource endowments against votes in committee for or against a political party's position. Exogenous shocks are not a sufficient explanatory variable to affect change in 4 periods. If you want to actually look at what's happened after 3/11, there's a question of whether or not we're going back to the status quo ante. Restructuring was usually preceded by prevailing economic theoretical consensus and policy image cascades, affecting as blueprints in organizing electric power markets in Japan. And today, despite declining returns on invested capital, rising weighted average cost of capital, and stagnant but high electricity prices, Japan is currently in restructuring limbo. Consequently, economic theoretical consensus, journalistic attention, and yes, even positive results surrounding the effectiveness of vertical unbundling, feed-in tariffs, and a liberalized market are, at best, mixed, unlike in previous market stages. These are my tentative conclusions. Feel free to disagree with me. I welcome your feedback and your comments. Thank you.